But as I was cleaning up my garden over the past week or so, I thought of a story of a friend that I have that decided he wanted to start growing a garden too. Now, I remind you, this is someone that has no experience growing anything. No kind of plant, no kind of house plant, nothing. But after watching a few YouTube videos and reading a couple of blogs, he was convinced that he could grow a garden. And it takes a little more than that. So they went all out. They got landscaping timbers and built little garden beds and brought in the dirt and bought all these seeds, and they planted all these seeds and they watered everything every day. And he watched as little tiny shoots pop up out of the ground. He was so excited. He would come in and tell me what he's got sticking up out of the ground, and he planted this and he planted that. And I guess he thought he was a farmer now because he was able to plant these little things and they were growing. Well, a couple of months passed, and it was about time that he should have started harvesting something. But instead of being thrilled about tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers, he realized that his garden was full of weeds. That he had basically been watering the weeds, that a lot of the seeds he either didn't plant deep enough or didn't take care of, or birds came in and picked those seeds out. So he was watering weeds for the whole, several weeks. And he had no idea to tell the difference between a seedling, and a weed. So he'd been watering these things the whole time. He thought he was nurturing his crop, and he thought he was going to be, this big bumper crop of food. But I thought it was funny when I was out there trimming back my stuff, and I thought that was kind of funny. And it kind of reminds us of life. As believers, we're trying to grow in faith, and we're supposed to bear fruit. Amen? We are supposed to bear fruit. But all around us are weeds. People that try to influence the way we think and the way we talk and the way we live. And it seems like these people just pop up overnight, just like those weeds. And the challenge for us, just like my friend, I'm not going to mention his name because he might listen, but we often can't tell the difference between a good person and a bad person. We should be able to, but sometimes they mimic Christians. And this morning I'm going to talk about wheat and tares. There's a story in the Bible that Jesus gives the story of wheat and tares. So my message this morning is how to be a wheat in a world full of tares. And tares is basically a weed. So my sermon text this morning is from Matthew 13. And we're going to read verses 24 through 30. And then later we'll skip over to the same chapter, verses 36 through 43. But in this parable, while you're getting there, in this parable, things didn't go as planned for the farmer. And in this parable, this is one of only two parables where Jesus actually explains, he interprets his story because the disciples just weren't getting it. But in this parable, we see that what God's response is to an enemy of God's people. So in Matthew 13, verses 24 through 30, it says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a farmer who planted good seed in his field. But that night, as the workers slept, the enemy came in and planted weeds among the wheat. And then they slipped away. When the crop began to grow and produce, the weeds also grew. The farmer's workers went to him and said, 'Sir, the field where you planted that good seed is full of weeds. Where did they come from?' 'An enemy has done this,' the farmer said. 'Should we pull out the weeds?' they asked. And he said, 'No. You'll uproot the wheat if you do. Let both grow together until harvest time. Then I will tell the harvesters to sort out the wheat with the weeds. They're going to tie the weeds together in a bundle and they're going to burn them. And then they'll put the wheat in the barn to be stored.'" So let's look at some of the discoveries that we can find that were made of the weeds that they found in the field. So first of all, let's talk about the discovery of those weeds, or the tares. They call them tares in the Bible. It says, "When the crop began to grow and produce grain, the weeds also grew." The farmer nor the workers that were there didn't plant those weeds. They didn't plant those tares. And those tares are basically a mimic weed, right? They look like wheat, almost identical, but they're not. And as many of you guys that grow gardens, Maxine, a couple other people grow gardens, when things first start popping up, it all looks the same. It's hard to tell the difference unless you know exactly where you planted what you planted. So what you will understand and know is that what we plant will grow, right? If we plant tomatoes, there's going to be a tomato there somewhere, but there might be a weed in there. So in our gardens and in our lives, there are good and bad things that grow side by side. There are good and bad things that go with us every day through life. And in Matthew 28, the verse says, "The enemy has done this," the farmer explained. "Should we pull the weeds?" they asked. Now, this was not the plan by the farmer. It was not the will of the farmer for the weeds to be there, right? But when we read the interpretation of this parable by Jesus, you'll see that obviously this was, that this world is not also how God originally had planned it to be. So it says, the enemy who planted these weeds among the wheat is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the harvesters are the angels. This is part of this parable that Jesus is starting to explain. Now, on a side note, okay, the parable also reveals a constant conflict between God and the devil. And you need to see this in order to understand what's going on in this parable. And what it is this is always going on all around us. There's a constant battle all the time between good and evil, between God and Satan. And the whole point of Jesus coming into this world was to deal with the enemy, to give us an escape from that penalty of sin. In 1 John 3:8 it says, when people keep on sinning, it shows that they belong to the devil, who has been sinning since the beginning of time. But the Son of God came to destroy the works of the devil. So God intended for the world in the beginning to be perfect, and it was. If you read after everything He created on each day, He said it was good. So He intended for everything to be perfect. And then Adam and Eve, if Adam and Eve would have never sinned, there would be no death, there would be no sorrow, there would be no sickness. But they let Satan in. And weeds are the result. The discovery of the tares were problematic because they were growing together with the good stuff. If the workers would have just went in and ripped up those weeds, you risk the danger of pulling up the wheat, ruining their root system, killing off that good seed. Their roots, just like in the garden, when you pull out those little seedlings with the stuff, the roots get intertwined, they grow together. But tares in the Bible were worthless. As a matter of fact, tares were so bad that there was a Roman law, and I didn't know this until I did some studying this weekend, that forbade the sowing of tares in the field of an enemy. And they believed that this weed, these tares were called darnel. And they were poisonous. And that's why an enemy, if you had an enemy, he would sneak in and he would sow these weeds in your wheat field. He wanted to kill you off. But the weeds grew among the wheat, and if you got a taste of the tare with the wheat, you would tell that it was something bitter about it. And if you ingested some of this weed, it could cause dizziness, it could cause sleepiness, it could cause vomiting, and if you ingest enough, it could cause you to die. So to find tares in your field was bad news. So the Romans made up this law that it would be illegal to sow tares. Same thing with back in the Old Testament. If you had an enemy, you would go out in the middle of the night and you would salt their field. You would kill everything. But the discovery of those tares initiated a plan. Right? Just like when Adam and Eve sinned, God initiated a plan. In Matthew 13:30, Jesus said, "Let both grow together until the harvest. And then tell the harvester to sort out the weeds and to tie them together in bundles and then to burn them." and then put the wheat in the barn. He said, let both grow together. Both good and bad grow side by side. Sometimes this makes people question God. It makes people question, does God really exist? I just had this conversation last night. Some people back in the 60s thought God was dead. If you're alive in the 60s, you may remember there was a movement that was called the God is Dead movement in the 1960s. And Time magazine, on the cover of Time magazine, a big black cover, red trim, and it said right there in big red print, God is dead. This was back in 1966. So the question was asked, is God is dead? And it amazes me because we have so many people out there this morning that believe Elvis is alive, but God is dead. Right? I just cannot understand people this morning. But the reason they thought God was dead, because if God is alive, why does evil still continue? If God is alive, why is there sickness and little babies that die? And why are there wars? But God is not dead. It's not harvest time yet. God's plan is unfolding, though, before our very eyes. And He's patient. And He's given us time for the wheat to grow. He's given us time to talk to our family and our friends. But harvest time's coming. It's coming, and we need to be ready. In Revelation 13 through 15, it says, and I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this down. Blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they are blessed indeed, for they will rest from their hard work for the good deeds that followed them. Then I saw a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was someone like the Son of Man. And he had a gold crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. It was harvest time. That's what it's telling us. One day, Jesus, the Son of Man, is going to come back and He's going to harvest. And all of us that follow Him are going to be put in the barn to be stored. And all those that are not are going to be tied together and burned like weeds. So we need to be able to see the differences between wheat and tares, and we need to talk to people this morning. We need to go out and share the gospel. Tares are mimic weeds, like I said, and the farmer could tell the difference. We need to be careful in our walk. We need to be careful who we hang with. I mean, don't get me wrong, we have to be around sinners. We have to be around non-believers. That's the only way they're going to find their way to Jesus. But we got to be careful. We need to make sure that it doesn't flip-flop and the wheat start to mimic the tares. So what are the differences? What are the main differences between a wheat and a tare this morning? In John 8, 41 through 47, we read, you are imitating your father. We aren't illegitimate children. God Himself is our true Father. Jesus told them, if God were your Father, you would love me because I have come to you from God. I am not here on my own, but He sent me. Why can't you understand what I'm saying? It's because you can't even hear me. For you are children of your father, the devil. And you love to do the evil things as he does. He's been a murderer from the beginning. He's always hated the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, it is consistent with his character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So when I tell you the truth, you just naturally don't believe me. Which of you can truthfully accuse me of sin? And since I am telling you the truth, why don't you believe me? Anyone who belongs to God listens gladly to the words of God, but you don't listen because you don't belong to God. So this parable of the wheat and the tares also provides an illustration about apostasy. And apostasy, or someone who is apostate, is simply someone who was a believer at one time and then abandoned it. So if we were to apply that to the parable, it's like they were in the same field, but they were false wheat. And in the same way, in any given church service, in any given small group, in any men or women's meetings, there may be true born-again believers side by side sitting with pretenders, people that are apostate. Those who enjoy the message, those who enjoy the music, and those who like the fellowship. They like the good time, but they never have ever repented of their sins. They've never ever accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. To any human observer, the true believer and the pretender look pretty identical. They look pretty much the same. And only God can see their heart. But as I read John 8 this morning, and as I read it earlier in the week, we see that our lifestyles will reveal who we belong to. There are some people out there that say they're Christian that I've seen walk out of a bar. There are some people that say they're Christian that I've heard some of the music that they listen to that would state otherwise. There are some people out there that say they're Christian and their language doesn't point to that fact. They're just outward Christians. There's no change inside. So our lifestyles reveal who our Father is. And then that last verse said, anyone who belongs to God listens gladly to the words of God. But if you don't listen, you don't belong to God. Hearing, heeding, giving into, even we just need to reflect who our daddy is. And some people do. Our lifestyle determines if we are wheat or tare, if we are wheat or weeds. Because whoever is born of God does not go out and continually sin, does not go out and do the same thing over and over again, because they've been born again, they're new, they're different. Who doesn't practice righteousness? And we're not going to get it perfect. We are not perfect. I am not perfect. But we do try. Right? We do try to live righteously. But who does not practice righteousness is not of God. Whoever does not love his brother or his sister or his neighbor or the stranger that they meet on the side of the road is not of God this morning. Tares, like I said, can superficially look like that wheat. It's not good enough to look like a Christian. It's not good enough. There are people who come to every church service every Sunday. They look like Christians, like I said, because they come to church, but that is not enough. Coming to church is not going to get you in heaven. Watching a YouTube video of a guy preaching is not going to get you into heaven. It's not enough. You can't just mimic Christianity. You have to be a Christian. You have to live that lifestyle. The people who come to church and pretend to be Christians, they're the ones who sow confusion. They're the ones who start chaos. We were just talking this morning or yesterday about churches falling apart because there'll be confusion and chaos that break loose. There'll be backstabbing and backbiting and all this talking behind people's backs and spreading rumors. That's not of God. Those are lookalikes. They're here to deceive and to separate. They're working against the kingdom of God. They may be a false teacher. They may be leading our kids in Sunday school class or a small group or up on the stage preaching. But they may be telling you part truths. And that's why I always say, whatever I preach, write down those passages. Go back home and read it. Do your own study. But it's important for us as Christians to have discernment. We need to be able to tell what's real and what's not. In 1 John 3, 7 through 10, he tells us, do not be deceived. Pay attention. Those who keep sinning belong to the devil, and those who have been born again into God's family do not make practice of sinning. Now, lastly, let's look at the destination of the two, right? The destination of the wheat and tares. In Matthew 13, 36 through 43, Jesus interprets this parable. Because, like I said, sometimes the disciples were thick-headed. Sometimes they didn't get it. But he says, then, leaving the crowds outside, Jesus went into the house. His disciples said, please explain to us the story of the weeds in the field. Jesus replied, the Son of Man is the farmer who plants good seed. The field is the world, and the good seed represents the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people who belong to the evil one. The enemy who planted the weeds among the wheat is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the harvesters are the angels. Just as the weeds are sorted out and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the world. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will remove from his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. And the angels will throw them into a fiery furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the Father's kingdom, and anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. He broke all this down for them so that even they could understand that this whole parable was about destiny. Jesus placed the greatest value on this parable on eternal destination. And time again, he does this in these parables. Just in the Gospels alone, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the word eternal is mentioned 16 times. The word everlasting is mentioned 14 times. And the word forever is mentioned at least 10 times. And in Mark 8:36 through 37, it says, what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? And if you think back through some of the characters in the Bible, I think Judas was a tare. I really do. I think Judas was a mimic. In Mark 14:21, Jesus said, for the Son of Man must die, as the Scriptures declared long ago, but how terrible it would be for the one who betrays him. It would be far better for the man to have never been born. Jesus said it would be better for us to not even exist than to be separated from God. You see, until Christ came, heaven and earth were kind of vague in the Old Testament. But when Jesus showed up, he immediately started preaching about destiny. In Matthew 6:19 through 21, he said, not to lay up treasures for yourself in heaven, on earth, but do so in heaven. And in Luke 13:24, he said, to strive to enter the straight gate. Many will try, but not make it. So the tares, they'll find destiny. They'll find their destiny because the tares are gathered and they're burned. Just as the weeds are sorted and burned in this parable, they'll be thrown into a fiery furnace. Now, why will this happen? Why would Jesus come through and have his angels harvest everybody and then separate them? Why do we grow vegetables and fruit? Because we want that fruit. We want them to bear fruit. We want to be able to have something tangible to eat and to give us nourishment. So they don't bear any fruit, number one. Number two, they entangle. They impede. And they hinder the believers. They hinder the good. They hurt. They harm. They cause some to stumble. They cause some to fall back. And they may look like the real deal. I just heard yesterday of another pastor that had done something and now he's fallen. Some TV evangelist. Just because your name is on a church roll, and I'm going to get real this morning. Just because your name's on a church roll or a church book, or just because you're a member, doesn't ensure that you'll be in heaven. You can't just look like a Christian. You have to be Christian. You have to be a true follower. You know, mom and dad, if you're a kid here this morning, you're not saved. A mom and dad cannot pray you into heaven. They could come to church and pray for you and pray for you and pray for you, but it's your decision. You know, when I was a kid, mom and dad made their kids go to school church every Sunday and every Wednesday and every Sunday night. But just because those kids came to church, just because those teens came to church, it didn't mean anything unless they make that decision. Now, what's the destiny of the wheat? We talked about the tares. We know they're going to be cut, tied, and burned. Matthew 13:43 says, "Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the Father's kingdom." Now, how do we live as wheat in a world full of tares? That was my message this morning. Number one, we have to bear fruit. What does that mean? We have to do good works. We have to go out and minister to people. Even if you don't think you can minister, you can go out and share your story, your salvation story. You know, there's going to be things that you went through that someone else may be going through that you could give them some advice.